Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Sophia of Hanover, a princess born in exile who would become one of the most intellectually gifted women of her age, a patron of philosophers and creator of magnificent gardens, a mother of kings and queens, and the woman who missed becoming Queen of Great Britain by a mere 8 weeks. We'll softly explore her remarkable 84-year journey, from her birth as the 12th child of exiled royalty to her lonely childhood in Leiden, where her mother preferred the company of monkeys, from her education in 7 languages to her bout with smallpox that scarred her beauty, from her marriage to Ernest Augustus and the agonizing 3-day labor that nearly killed her, to her flourishing intellectual friendship with Gottfried Leibniz that lasted 38 years, from her transformation of the Herrenhausen Gardens into a Baroque masterpiece to her elevation as Electress of Hanover, from the death of a young English prince that suddenly made her heir to the British throne, to her 13-year wait filled with Queen Anne's jealous hostility, all while the great powers of Europe shifted and transformed around her, while philosophy and science advanced, while gardens bloomed and children were born and wars raged across the continent. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. I'll leave a gentle comment about which part of Sophia's remarkable story resonates with you most. Was it her intellectual brilliance, her gardens, her patience, or that tragic rainstorm? And subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 17th century Europe lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Sophia, later known as Electress Sophia of Hanover, entered the world on October 14th, 1630, on a morning when autumn had already begun to paint the Dutch countryside in shades of gold and amber. The place was the Wassenaar Hof in the Hague, a modest residence that served as the temporary home of 2 royal exiles who had lost everything but their titles and their dignity. The room where she was born was not a grand palace chamber hung with silk and decorated with gold. There were no court physicians in elaborate robes, no ladies-in-waiting dressed in the finest fashions of the age. The birth took place in borrowed quarters, attended by midwives and a handful of loyal servants who had followed the exile family from kingdom to kingdom, from hope to disappointment, from prosperity to poverty. Outside the windows, the flat Dutch landscape stretched away toward the horizon, broken only by windmills turning slowly in the October breeze and canals reflecting the pale northern sky. The Netherlands had become a refuge for Protestant exiles from across Europe, and the House of Orange had given shelter to Sophia's parents when no one else would. Her father was Frederick V, a man whose dreams of greatness had been spectacularly, tragically crushed. He had been Elector Palatine of the Rhine, one of the 7 princes who held the right to elect the Holy Roman Emperor, and that would have been honor enough for most men. But in 1619, the Protestant nobles of Bohemia had offered him their crown, and Frederick had accepted, seeing it as God's will and a chance to strengthen the Protestant cause in Central Europe. It was a disastrous decision. Frederick and his wife Elizabeth arrived in Prague in October 1619 and were crowned King and Queen of Bohemia with great ceremony. But their reign lasted barely 1 winter before the forces of the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, backed by Spain and Bavaria, swept down upon them. The Battle of White Mountain in November 1620 shattered Frederick's army, and he and Elizabeth fled Prague in the middle of the night, abandoning their kingdom, their possessions, and their hopes. They never returned. Frederick lost not only Bohemia, but also his hereditary electorate of the Palatinate, which was given to the Duke of Bavaria as punishment for his rebellion. From being a king and an elector, Frederick was reduced to being a landless exile, dependent on the charity of relatives and the hospitality of the Dutch. This was the father Sophia would barely know. Frederick V, mockingly called the Winter King, because his reign had lasted only one season, died in 1632 when Sophia was just 2 years old. He left behind a widow, 13 children, and debts that would take decades to repay, as Sophia's mother was in many ways even more interesting than her father. Elizabeth Stuart was the daughter of King James I of England and Scotland, a princess who had been considered one of the greatest beauties of her age. Her nickname, the Queen of Hearts, reflected both her physical attractiveness and the genuine affection that people felt for her. Even in exile, even in poverty, Elizabeth maintained a certain regal bearing that commanded respect, but Elizabeth was not a warm or nurturing mother. She had given birth to 13 children between 1616 and 1632, an exhausting procession of pregnancies and births and infant care that had left her emotionally drained. By the time Sophia arrived as the 12th child, Elizabeth had little maternal affection left to give, as she found comfort instead in her pets. She kept monkeys, dogs and birds, and in correspondence with her many relatives across Europe. Years later, Sophia would write with characteristic honesty about her mother's neglect. She preferred the sight of her monkeys to us, Sophia recorded in her memoirs, a simple statement that carried depths of childhood hurt. It was not said with bitterness, exactly, but rather with a clear-eyed assessment of someone who had long ago accepted the reality of her early life. The circumstances surrounding Sophia's birth were marked by tragedy beyond mere exile and poverty. On the very day that Sophia entered the world, her eldest brother Frederick Henry drowned. He was swimming in a canal when the accident occurred, and despite frantic rescue attempts, he could not be saved. The household that should have been celebrating the arrival of a new princess was instead plunged into mourning for the lost prince. It was an omen, perhaps, of the way death and life would walk hand in hand through Sophia's long existence. She would lose brothers and sisters throughout her childhood, would bury 2 of her own sons in military service, would see her beloved daughter die decades before her time. The lesson was learned early. Nothing was permanent, nothing was guaranteed, and survival required a certain toughness of spirit. 3 days after Sophia's birth, another tragedy struck. Her sister, Princess Charlotte, who had been ill, finally succumbed to her disease. On January 30th, 1631, the family gathered at the Kloosterkerk in The Hague for a double ceremony, first to bury Charlotte, and then, in the same church, to baptize the infant Sophia. The contrast must have been almost unbearable. The same church that heard funeral prayers for one princess heard baptismal prayers for another. The same family that wept for a lost daughter celebrated the christening of a new one. 3 noble ladies named Sophia stood as godmothers for the child, lending their names and, theoretically, their protection. But what protection could godmothers offer to a penniless princess born in exile? The estates of Friesland, one of the provinces of the Dutch Republic, granted the newborn Sophia an annuity of 40 thalers. It was a small gesture, but in a household where every coin mattered, it was significant. This modest income would help pay for Sophia's upbringing and education, ensuring that she would not be entirely dependent on her mother's depleted resources. Shortly after her baptism, a decision was made that would shape the first decade of Sophia's life. The infant princess was taken from The Hague to the city of Leiden, some 10 miles distant, to be raised by governesses at a distance from her mother's household. The official reason was that Elizabeth could better manage her reduced household without so many young children underfoot. The real reason, which Sophia later understood perfectly well, was that Elizabeth simply could not cope with the emotional demands of caring for so many offspring. Leiden in the 1630s was a thriving city, home to one of the great universities of Europe. Founded in 1575 as a reward for the city's heroic resistance to Spanish siege during the Dutch Revolt, Leiden University had become a center of Protestant learning, attracting scholars from across Europe. The city's streets were lined with bookshops and printing houses. An intellectual debate flourished in its coffee houses and lecture halls. But the infant Sophia knew nothing of this intellectual ferment. She was placed in the care of Madame de Plessen and her daughters, particularly Marie de Quat, who would oversee the young princess's daily routine. The household where Sophia grew up was respectable but modest, a far cry from a royal palace. As Sophia grew from infant to child, her days took on a rigid, unchanging pattern. She would later describe this routine in her memoirs with a mixture of wry humor and lingering resentment, her sharp observational skills already evident even in recalling childhood tedium. Each morning began at 7 o'clock. Young Sophia was required to rise and present herself, still in her nightclothes, en déshabillé, as she described it, to Mademoiselle Marie de Quat. The ritual never varied. First came prayers, recited in Dutch or French, depending on the day. Then came Bible reading, with Marie selecting passages that she deemed appropriate for a young princess's moral education. After the religious instruction came secular lessons. Marie taught Sophia the quatrains of Pibrac, a collection of moral verses by the French poet Guy Dufour de Pibrac. These quatrains, written in the 1570s, were considered excellent tools for teaching virtue and proper behavior to young nobles. Each 4-line verse contained a moral lesson, and Sophia was required to memorize them and recite them back. But Sophia's strongest memories of these morning sessions had little to do with prayers or poetry. What she remembered most vividly, what had remained in my imagination far better than all she tried to teach me, as she later wrote, were Marie de Quat's grimaces as she cleaned her teeth. Dental hygiene in the 17th century was rudimentary at best, and Marie's teeth always had need of cleaning, as Sophia delicately phrased it. While supposedly teaching the young princess, Marie would use the time to rinse her mouth and scrub her teeth, making faces that the observant child found far more memorable than any moral quatrain. And this detail tells us something important about young Sophia. Even as a child, she was watching, observing, filing away details. She had a sharp eye for human absurdity and hypocrisy, and she was not inclined to romanticize her childhood or her teachers. This clear-eyed honesty would serve her well throughout her life. After the morning lessons came breakfast, then more instruction. Sophia learned to read and write in multiple languages. Her native tongue was German, but she also learned Dutch, necessary in the Netherlands, French, the language of culture and diplomacy, and English, her mother's native language. Latin and Greek would come later, along with Italian. By the time her formal education was complete, Sophia would be fluent in 7 languages, a remarkable achievement even among the highly educated nobility of her era. She studied mathematics, which was unusual for girls of her time. Most female education focused on music, dancing, embroidery, and other accomplishments deemed suitable for noble women. But Sophia's tutors included mathematical instruction, teaching her arithmetic and basic geometry. This training in logical thinking would later prove valuable in her philosophical discussions with Leibniz. History was another major subject. Sophia learned about the great empires of the past, Rome, Greece, Egypt, and about the complex politics of contemporary Europe. She studied the history of her own family, learning about her grandfather King James I of England, about the Stuart Dynasty, about the Protestant Reformation that had divided Europe and continued to drive the wars that had destroyed her father's kingdom. Theology was not neglected. And as a Protestant princess, Sophia was expected to have a thorough understanding of Reformed doctrine. She studied the Bible, learned the Heidelberg Catechism, and absorbed the theological arguments that distinguished Protestants from Catholics. This religious education was not merely academic. In an age when religious affiliation determined political alliances and succession rights, knowing one's theology was a matter of practical importance. Despite the rigorous education, Sophia's childhood in Leiden was a lonely one. She was separated from most of her siblings, isolated from her mother, and surrounded by servants and teachers rather than playmates. The other children in the household were the daughters of her governesses, but there was always a barrier of rank that prevented true friendship. Sophia was a princess, even if an exiled and impoverished one, and the distance had to be maintained. News from the wider world filtered into the household in Leiden. Sophia heard about her siblings' activities, about her mother's continued efforts to secure the return of the Palatinate to the family, about the ongoing 30 Years' War that was devastating much of Central Europe. The war that had driven her parents into exile continued to rage, pulling in more countries, causing more destruction, claiming more lives. In 1632, when Sophia was just 2 years old, her father Frederick died of the plague at Mainz. He was only 36 years old, worn down by exile, disappointed hopes, and the efforts to raise money and troops to regain his lost kingdom. His death left Elizabeth a widow with 13 children and no resources beyond the charity of relatives. Sophia was too young to remember her father's death, but she would have heard the stories, seen the black crape and the mourning clothes, felt the change in the household's atmosphere. The Winter King was gone, and with him went any realistic hope of the family's restoration to Bohemian glory. As Sophia grew older, she became aware of her family's complicated position in European politics. Through her mother, she was the granddaughter of a king of England and Scotland. Through her father, she was descended from one of the most important electoral families of the Holy Roman Empire. Her relatives included kings, queens, electors, dukes, and princes across Protestant Europe. But titles without power, lineage without land, and were cold comfort. Sophia was a princess who lived in borrowed rooms in a university town, dependent on a small annuity and the kindness of Dutch burghers. The contrast between her exalted birth and her modest circumstances was not lost on the observant child. At the age of 10, Sophia's education in Leiden came to an end. In 1640, she returned to The Hague to rejoin what remained of her family. By this time, the household had shrunk considerably. Death had claimed several of Sophia's siblings. Her eldest brother Frederick Henry had drowned. Charlotte had died in infancy. Prince Louis had died in 1624. Princess Henrietta Maria had died in 1629. And Prince Philip had died in 1630. Of the 13 children Elizabeth Stuart had borne, only 8 survived to adulthood, and of those 8, most had already left home to pursue their own fortunes. Sophia's brother Karl Ludwig was in England, trying to rally support for the family's cause. Her sister Elizabeth was living with relatives in Brandenburg. Her brother Rupert was beginning what would become a famous military career. When Sophia returned to The Hague, she found herself sharing her mother's household with only her sister Louise. The two girls, close in age, became companions in the melancholy court of an exiled queen who spent more time with her pets than with her daughters. The household at The Hague, where Sophia spent her early teenage years, was a curious mixture of fallen royalty and determined hope. Elizabeth Stuart maintained as much ceremony and protocol as her reduced circumstances would allow. There were still ladies-in-waiting, though fewer than there would have been at a proper court. There were still regular meals served with attention to precedence and rank, though the food was simpler than it would have been in a palace. There were still formal receptions when distinguished visitors passed through the Hague, though these were held in borrowed rooms rather than throne rooms. Elizabeth refused to completely abandon the trappings of royalty, even in exile. She insisted on being addressed by her title, though whether she should be called Queen or ex-Queen of Bohemia was a matter of some delicate debate. She wore mourning black for her husband, but made sure the fabric was of good quality and the cut fashionable. She could not afford jewels, but she still had her dignity. For Sophia, these years from 10 to 20 were a time of watching, learning, and understanding how power and politics worked. She saw how her mother wrote endless letters to relatives across Europe, always asking for money, always pressing claims, always reminding correspondents of past favors and family obligations. She observed how visitors treated her mother, with respect certainly, but tinged with pity and sometimes barely concealed condescension. She learned, too, about the complicated politics of religion in 17th century Europe. The 30 Years' War, which had begun in 1618 as a conflict between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire, had expanded into a general European war involving France, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, and dozens of German principalities. The war that had destroyed her father's kingdoms continued to rage, and religious affiliation determined which side every prince and city took. Sophia absorbed the lesson that being Protestant was not merely a matter of personal faith. It was a political identity that opened some doors and closed others, that created automatic alliances with some nations and enmity with others. This lesson would prove crucial later in her life, when her Protestant identity would make her heir to the British throne, despite dozens of Catholics with better hereditary claims. The Dutch Republic, where Sophia spent these formative years, was itself fascinating. Unlike most of Europe, which was organized into kingdoms and principalities ruled by hereditary nobility, the Netherlands was a republic, or rather, a federation of 7 provinces, each with considerable autonomy, and the stadtholders of the House of Orange provided military leadership and a quasi-royal figurehead, but real power lay with the merchant oligarchs who controlled trade and finance. The Netherlands in the 1640s was at the height of what historians would later call its golden age. Dutch ships sailed to every corner of the known world, bringing back spices from the East Indies, furs from North America, sugar from Brazil. Dutch merchants were the richest in Europe, and Amsterdam was challenging London and Paris as a cultural and intellectual center. Dutch painters, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Hals, were creating masterpieces. Dutch scientists and philosophers were making revolutionary discoveries and developing new ways of thinking about the natural world. Young Sophia absorbed all of this, so she saw that power did not have to come from birth and titles alone. It could come from commerce, from knowledge, from industry and innovation. The Netherlands showed that a republic of merchants could become as powerful as a kingdom of nobles. It was a lesson that stayed with her, informing her later patronage of scholars and her appreciation for merit as well as birth. In 1649, when Sophia was approaching her 19th birthday, news arrived that would change the family's fortune somewhat. Her eldest surviving brother, Karl Ludwig, had been restored to the electorate of the Palatinate. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648 to end the 30 Years' War, had included provisions for Karl Ludwig to regain his father's hereditary lands, though not the electoral title that had been given to Bavaria. It was a partial victory, a restoration that fell far short of what Frederick V had once possessed, but it was better than nothing. Karl Ludwig was now Elector Palatine, with territories, income, and a position in the empire. He could finally afford to support his family members. In 1650, Karl Ludwig invited his younger sister Sophia to come live with him at Heidelberg. The invitation was both generous and practical. Karl Ludwig needed loyal family members to help him rebuild his war-devastated territories, and Sophia, now 20 years old, was intelligent enough to be useful and young enough to still be marriageable. Sophia accepted with alacrity. The prospect of leaving her mother's gloomy household and seeing new places filled her with excitement. She had spent her entire life in the Netherlands, and the chance to travel, to see the German lands from which her family came, to perhaps find a husband and establish her own household. All of this was immensely appealing. She made the journey up the Rhine River with 2 ladies in attendance, sailing past the castles and vineyards that lined that great waterway. The landscape changed from the flat Dutch countryside to the rolling hills of the German Rhineland. The river wound through gorges where ancient fortresses perched on cliff tops, through valleys where villages huddled around church steeples, past cities that had been wealthy before the war and were now struggling to rebuild. Heidelberg had suffered terribly during the 30 Years' War. The famous castle, once one of the architectural wonders of Germany, lay partially in ruins. French troops had sacked the city multiple times, and much of the population had fled or died. Karl Ludwig was engaged in the slow, difficult work of reconstruction, trying to attract settlers back to depopulated villages and rebuild the economy. Because the castle was uninhabitable, Karl Ludwig and his household lodged in a large house in the town. It was a come-down from a proper electoral residence, but it would have to do until funds could be found for major reconstruction. Sophia took up residence with her brother, adapting to yet another set of reduced circumstances. She had been in Heidelberg only a short time when disaster struck. In 1650, Sophia fell desperately ill with smallpox. Smallpox was one of the great killers of the early modern period, a disease that showed no respect for rank or wealth. It struck royalty and peasants alike, and it killed perhaps a third of those it infected. Those who survived were often left scarred, sometimes blinded, occasionally crippled by complications. There was no treatment. Physicians could only offer supportive care and hope that the patient's constitution was strong enough to fight off the disease. Sophia's illness followed the typical brutal course of smallpox. It began with fever, headache, and backache, symptoms that could have indicated many diseases. Then came the rash, starting in the mouth and throat, before spreading to the face and body. The spots developed into pustules filled with fluid, covering every part of Sophia's skin. The fever spiked dangerously high. Sophia drifted in and out of consciousness, attended by physicians who could do little but apply cool compresses and pray. For days, and it was uncertain whether she would survive, her brother kept vigil, and letters were dispatched to their mother in the Hague, warning that Sophia might not recover. But Sophia's constitution, strengthened perhaps by her hardy Dutch childhood, proved resilient. The fever broke, the pustules began to dry and scab over, and slowly, painfully, she recovered. But she bore the scars for the rest of her life. That year I had an attack of smallpox, which made a great breach in my beauty, Sophia later wrote, with characteristic frankness. The pockmarks covered her face, destroying whatever claims to conventional prettiness she might have had. In an age when a woman's appearance could determine her marital prospects and therefore her entire future, this was no small matter. Yet even as Sophia recovered and saw her scarred face in the mirror for the first time, she did not fall into despair. She had other qualities: intelligence, wit, education, royal blood, and an indomitable spirit. These would have to be her dowry, since beauty was now denied her. Her recovery took months. It was the summer of 1651 before Sophia felt well enough to fully participate in court life again. During her convalescence, she had time to think about her future. She was 20 years old, scarred by disease, without significant dowry, though of excellent family. What kind of marriage could she hope for? The question was not academic. For a princess, marriage was not primarily about love or even personal happiness. It was about political alliance, about securing the future, about producing heirs. Sophia understood this perfectly well. The question was finding a husband of suitable rank, who would accept a penniless, scarred princess, no matter how clever she might be. In 1652, a man passed through Heidelberg who would eventually change Sophia's life, though neither of them realized it at their first meaningful encounter. His name was Ernest Augustus, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and he was traveling through the German territories on what we might call a diplomatic tour, visiting various courts, paying respects to his relatives and peers, maintaining the social connections that lubricated the machinery of German politics. Ernest Augustus was what was known as a landless cadet, a younger son who had been born to privilege but not to power. He was the fourth son of Duke George of Brunswick-Lüneburg, which meant that under normal circumstances, he would inherit nothing. The eldest son would get the duchy and all the family lands, while the younger sons would have to make their way through military service, church positions, or advantageous marriages. This was the dilemma facing innumerable younger sons of noble families across Europe, too high-born to engage in trade or any profession other than war or religion, but too far from inheritance to have independent income. Some became mercenary generals, selling their services to foreign armies. Some took positions in cathedral chapters and eventually became bishops or abbots, combining religious duties with comfortable livings. A few managed to marry heiresses and establish themselves through their wives' property. But Ernest Augustus and his brother George William had worked out an unusual arrangement. George William, who was older and did have territories and income, had been expected to marry and produce heirs. But George William had no desire to marry. What he wanted was for his brother Ernest Augustus to have the family properties and income intact, rather than divided between multiple brothers as inheritance laws required. So the two brothers made a pact. George William would remain unmarried, would give up his share of the family estates to Ernest Augustus, and in return, Ernest Augustus would marry and produce heirs who would inherit the consolidated holdings. It was an arrangement that benefited Ernest Augustus enormously. He would go from being a landless younger son to being a wealthy duke, but it also meant he had obligations. He needed to find a suitable wife and establish a proper household. When Ernest Augustus passed through Heidelberg in 1652, he and Sophia met at a court function. They had actually encountered each other once before, when both were very young children, but this was their first meaningful interaction as adults. Sophia found him attractive. He was even handsomer than before, she wrote in her memoirs, and we can detect genuine interest in those words. Ernest Augustus was in his early 20s, well built, with the bearing of a man accustomed to military life and courtly manners. He dressed well, danced skillfully, and conversed intelligently on the subjects that interested Sophia: politics, literature, current events. But attraction alone did not make a marriage, particularly not among nobility, where so many other factors had to align. Ernest Augustus was interested in Sophia as well, but the negotiations between him and his brother George William were still ongoing. George William was proving reluctant to fully commit to his promise of remaining unmarried. He worried that he might change his mind later, or that something might happen to Ernest Augustus, leaving him without heirs. There was also the complication that George William had himself been courting Sophia as a potential bride before the brothers' arrangement was made. This made for an awkward situation. George William had pursued Sophia, then backed away to allow Ernest Augustus to have her, but still had not completely finalized the agreement that would make such a marriage possible. So Sophia waited, or she remained at her brother Karl Ludwig's court in Heidelberg. watching and hoping, but with no certainty about her future. The months stretched into years. 1652 became 1653, then 1654, and still the marriage negotiations dragged on. The uncertainty must have been agonizing. During this period, other suitors appeared. Sophia's royal blood and her sharp intelligence made her attractive despite her lack of dowry and her scarred face. There were tentative inquiries from various German princes, discussions about possible matches that never quite materialized. Most notably, there was interest from her cousin Charles Stuart. Charles was the eldest son of the executed King Charles I of England, and in the early 1650s, he was an impoverished exile living on the continent and waiting for a chance to reclaim his father's throne. Charles needed money desperately, and Sophia, though not wealthy, had her small annuity and potentially valuable connections. But Sophia, with her characteristic clear-sightedness, saw through Charles's interest. He wanted her money and connections, not Sophia herself. I recognized that his motives were purely financial, she later wrote, and she rejected his advances without hesitation. It was a decision that showed both pride and wisdom. She would not marry a man who valued her only as a source of funds, even if that man might someday be King of England. It's interesting to contemplate what might have happened if Sophia had accepted Charles. When the Stuart monarchy was restored in 1660, and Charles became King Charles II of England, Sophia would have been his queen. But Charles proved to be a faithless husband. His many mistresses were legendary, and Sophia would probably have been miserable. Moreover, Charles never had legitimate children, despite fathering numerous illegitimate ones, so Sophia's place in history would have been very different had she married him. The negotiations between Ernest Augustus and his brother George William finally came to a head in 1658. After 6 years of discussions, agreements, reconsiderations, and more discussions, George William finally, definitively agreed to remain unmarried and to pass his share of the family estates to Ernest Augustus. The pact was sealed with legal documents that were registered with the Holy Roman Emperor, making it binding and irreversible. Ernest Augustus was now free to marry, and more importantly, he now had the wealth and position to support a wife. He moved quickly. The marriage contract with Sophia was negotiated and signed. The date was set for October 17, 1658. It's worth noting that this was just 3 days after Sophia's 28th birthday. In the 17th century, this was quite old for a first marriage among nobility. Most noble women married in their late teens or early 20s. That Sophia was still unmarried at 28 testified both to her difficult circumstances and to her unwillingness to accept just any match. She had waited for something suitable, even if the waiting had been long and uncertain. The wedding took place in Heidelberg with as much ceremony as could be managed. Sophia wore a dress fashioned in the German style, à l'Allemagne, as she described it, made of silver brocade that must have cost a considerable sum. The fabric would have caught the light with every movement, shimmering like water or moonlight. Her hair was dressed in loose curls, rather than the tight formal arrangements that were fashionable at French courts, and on her head sat a great tiara of diamonds, borrowed from the family jewels, proclaiming her status despite her poverty. 4 maids of honor carried her train as she entered the chapel. The service was Protestant, of course, conducted according to the Reformed rites. There would have been hymns sung in German, prayers offered for the couple's future, scripture read aloud. Ernest Augustus stood waiting, dressed in his finest, probably relieved that after 6 years of negotiations, he was finally securing both a bride and his inheritance. Sophia's mother, Elizabeth, did not attend the wedding. This absence must have hurt, though Sophia recorded it in her memoirs without comment. Elizabeth remained at The Hague, unwilling or unable to make the journey to Heidelberg. Perhaps she was too ill to travel. Perhaps she simply couldn't muster the emotional energy to celebrate her 12th child's wedding. Or perhaps the relationship between mother and daughter had become so distant that Elizabeth saw no reason to make the effort. Whatever the reason, Sophia married without her mother's presence, another small wound in a lifetime of maternal neglect. But Sophia had made a crucial decision about this marriage. She later wrote that she was determined to love him. This was not a statement of passionate emotion, but of deliberate will. Sophia had decided that she would make this marriage work, that she would create affection and partnership through conscious effort, even if overwhelming romantic feeling was absent. It was a practical, clear-eyed approach, but one that showed genuine commitment and emotional maturity. After the wedding ceremony and the celebrations that followed, Sophia and Ernest Augustus prepared to leave Heidelberg and travel to Hanover, where they would make their home. Sophia was saying goodbye to her brother Karl Ludwig, to the household where she had lived for 8 years, to the city where she had survived smallpox and waited through years of uncertainty, as she was embarking on an entirely new life, and she approached it with a mixture of hope, determination, and perhaps some natural trepidation. The journey to Hanover took them north through German territories that were still recovering from the devastation of the 30 Years' War. The peace had been signed 10 years earlier, in 1648, but the work of rebuilding was far from complete. Sophia would have seen ruined villages, abandoned fields returning to forest, population levels still far below what they had been before the war. The 30 Years' War had killed perhaps a third of the German population through violence, disease, and famine, one of the worst demographic catastrophes in European history. When Sophia and Ernest Augustus arrived in Hanover in late 1658, they were welcomed by Ernest Augustus's mother, who still resided at the Leine Schloss, the ducal palace. This was to be Sophia's new home, and she must have assessed it carefully. Hanover in 1658 was a modest city by European standards, with perhaps 10,000 inhabitants. It had been founded in medieval times and had grown up around a crossing of the River Leine. The city was a member of the Hanseatic League, the great trading confederation of northern European cities, though it was not among the League's most important members. The ducal palace, the Leine Schloss, sat on an island in the river, connected to the city by bridges. The palace was solid and respectable, but not grand. It had been built in the late 16th century, in a style that mixed traditional German elements with new Renaissance influences from Italy. Inside, the rooms were well proportioned, but not ostentatiously decorated. This was a working ducal residence, not a showcase palace designed to awe visitors with wealth and power. Sophia took stock of her new circumstances. She was now Duchess of Brunswick-Lüneburg, a title that carried some prestige. Her husband had territories and income, though he shared these with his brothers in the complicated German fashion, where family lands were divided and subdivided with each generation. They would not be wealthy, exactly, but neither would they be poor. It was a comfortable, secure position, far better than being a penniless, exiled princess dependent on relatives' charity. She set about establishing herself in the household, learning the rhythms of court life in Hanover, meeting the courtiers and servants, figuring out who was important and who merely thought they were important. Sophia had watched her mother navigate court politics for years, and she applied those lessons now. She was gracious but firm, friendly but aware of rank, approachable but ultimately in command as the Duchess. But Sophia's thoughts were not solely occupied with social position and household management. She had married with the clear understanding that her primary duty was to produce heirs. Without children, her marriage would be considered a failure no matter how pleasant or companionable it might be. And so, Almost immediately after the wedding, Sophia became pregnant. The pregnancy progressed through the winter of 1658 and into the spring of 1659. Sophia was attended by midwives and physicians, as befitted a duchess, but pregnancy and childbirth in the 17th century were dangerous for women of all ranks. Many women died in childbirth, and many more lost their babies. Sophia knew the risks, but she had no choice but to accept them. As her time approached in May 1660, Sophia prepared herself as best she could. She made her will, ensuring that her few personal possessions would be disposed of according to her wishes if she died. She received communion, making her peace with God, in case this birth was her last act on earth, and she waited. The labor began in late May. At first, it seemed like it might be proceeding normally, but as hours stretched into a day, and then into a second day, it became clear that something was wrong. The baby was not coming, despite Sophia's agony and the best efforts of the midwives. By the third day, everyone attending her believed that both mother and child would die. The midwives spoke in hushed tones about the tragic loss that seemed inevitable. Priests were summoned to perform last rites. The household prepared for mourning. For 3 days and 3 nights, Sophia endured pain that we can barely imagine. In our modern age of analgesics and caesarean sections, there was no relief, no escape, no surgical intervention possible. She could only endure, pray, and push, knowing that each hour increased the likelihood that neither she nor her child would survive. We do not know exactly what medical complications made the birth so difficult, and perhaps the baby was in an awkward position. Perhaps Sophia's pelvis was too narrow for an easy delivery. Perhaps there were other factors that the 17th century physicians could neither diagnose nor treat. What we do know is that Sophia came as close to death as it is possible to come and still survive. Finally, on May 28, 1660, after 72 hours of labor, the baby was born. It was a boy, alive against all odds, born to a mother who had barely survived bringing him into the world. He was named George Louis, and he would grow up to become King George I of Great Britain, founder of the Hanoverian Dynasty that would rule Britain for over 2 centuries. But on that May morning, as Sophia lay exhausted and traumatized, having survived what should have killed her, she could not have imagined such a future. She knew only that she had a son, that she was alive, and that she needed to recover her strength. The physicians ordered her to bed rest, and Sophia would spend the next 6 weeks lying in a darkened room, slowly regaining her health, while wet nurses cared for the infant George Louis. It's worth noting an interesting historical coincidence. On May 29, 1660, the day after George Louis's birth, Sophia's cousin Charles Stuart, who had once courted her for her money, made his triumphal entry into London as King Charles II. The Stuart Restoration was celebrated throughout England and across Europe. Observers commented on the dramatic change of fortune for the exiled prince who had become a king. Sophia, lying in her bed in Hanover, and heard the news and must have reflected on the different paths her life might have taken. If she had married Charles when he was penniless, she would now be Queen of England, but she had chosen Ernest Augustus instead, and now she had nearly died giving birth to their son. Which choice was better? Only time would tell. The difficult birth left Sophia with a profound appreciation for the fragility of life and a healthy respect for the dangers of childbirth. Many women in her position, having barely survived once, would have been terrified of becoming pregnant again. But Sophia understood her duty. She needed to provide her husband with multiple sons. One heir alone was too risky, for children died with alarming frequency in the 17th century. And so, once she had recovered, she steeled herself for more pregnancies, and her fears proved somewhat justified. The birth of her second son, Frederick Augustus, in 1661 was also difficult, though not as nightmarishly prolonged as the first. But Sophia survived, and so did the baby. With 2 living sons, the succession seemed more secure. In 1664, when George Louis was 4 and Frederick Augustus was 3, Sophia and Ernest Augustus made an extended trip to Italy. Such grand tours were customary among wealthy nobles, combining pleasure with diplomacy. For Ernest Augustus, it was a chance to strengthen ties with Italian princes and perhaps to scout military opportunities. He was, after all, a professional soldier as well as a duke. For Sophia, the Italian journey was a revelation, and she had spent her entire life in Northern Europe, the Netherlands and Germany, where the climate was cool and grey, where the architecture was solid and practical rather than beautiful, where art was valued but not quite as central to life as it was in the Mediterranean world. Italy was different. The warm southern sun, the clear blue skies, the ancient ruins of Rome speaking of vanished empires, the Renaissance art in Florence and Venice, the music and opera that filled Italian theatres, the sophisticated conversation of Italian courtiers and intellectuals, all of it enchanted Sophia. She visited the great cities, saw masterpieces by Michelangelo and Raphael, attended performances of the new art form called opera, and engaged in lengthy discussions with scholars and philosophers. The trip lasted nearly a year, from 1664 into 1665. While Sophia was away, she wrote regularly to the governesses caring for her young sons, anxious to stay informed about their health and development. These letters reveal a mother who genuinely cared about her children, who wanted to know not just that they were physically well, but how they were progressing in their education and character formation. "Tell me how George Louis behaves," she wrote in one letter. "Is he obedient to his tutors? Does he apply himself to his lessons? What are his favorite activities?" Such detailed concern was not universal among noble mothers of the era, many of whom left child-rearing entirely to servants. But Sophia, perhaps remembering her own mother's neglect, was determined to be more involved. When Sophia and Ernest Augustus returned from Italy in 1665, they found their sons healthy and growing. The household at Hanover had managed well in their absence. Sophia resumed her duties as Duchess, but she was now pregnant again. Her third child, a son named Maximilian Wilhelm, was born in 1666. Then came her only surviving daughter, Sophia Charlotte, born in 1668. Sophia Charlotte's birth was particularly joyful. After 3 sons, Sophia finally had a daughter, and from the beginning, there was a special bond between mother and daughter. Sophia Charlotte was named after her mother, the Charlotte being added to distinguish daughter from mother, and would grow up to share Sophia's love of learning and philosophy. And 2 more sons followed, Charles Philip in 1669 and Ernest Augustus the Younger in 1674. Additionally, Sophia bore several children who died in infancy, as was heartbreakingly common in that era. But 7 of her children survived to adulthood: George Louis, Frederick Augustus, Maximilian Wilhelm, Sophia Charlotte, Charles Philip, and Ernest Augustus the Younger. A 7th son, Christian, was born but died young. This was an extraordinarily high survival rate for the 17th century. Many noble families lost half or more of their children before adulthood. That Sophia managed to raise 7 children to maturity speaks both to good fortune and to a careful attention to their health and well-being. The year 1676 brought a change to Sophia's life that would prove as significant as her marriage, though in a completely different way. A new courtier arrived at Hanover, appointed as librarian and counselor to the ducal household. His name was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and he was 30 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and desperately seeking an environment where he could pursue his intellectual work. Leibniz had already lived a remarkable life. Born in Leipzig in 1646, the son of a professor of moral philosophy, he had proven to be a prodigy. He taught himself Latin by age 7 and Greek soon after. He had studied philosophy, law, and mathematics at various universities, earning a doctorate in law at age 20. He had worked on legal reform projects for the Elector of Mainz and had been sent to Paris on a diplomatic mission. In Paris, Leibniz had encountered the most advanced mathematical and scientific thinking of the age. He met leading scholars, studied geometry and algebra, and began developing what would become the calculus, the revolutionary mathematical tool for analyzing change and motion. He did this work independently of Isaac Newton, who was developing similar ideas in England at the same time. The question of who invented calculus first would become a bitter controversy later in Leibniz's life. But in 1676, when Leibniz arrived in Hanover, he was a young scholar looking for patronage and stability. His employer in Mainz had died. His diplomatic missions had not led to permanent positions, and he needed a regular income to support his intellectual work. The position at Hanover, librarian to the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, was not glamorous, but it provided salary, security, and time to work on his projects. Leibniz found the court at Hanover disappointing in many ways. Most of the courtiers were interested in hunting, fashion, gambling, and court intrigue, not in philosophy or mathematics. In letters to friends, Leibniz complained bitterly about his intellectual isolation. "I am not in a great city like Paris or London, which are full of learned men from whom one can benefit," he wrote. "Here one finds scarcely anyone with whom to talk of learned matters. Or rather, I'm in this region. A courtier is not supposed to speak of learned matters." Then he added a crucial qualification that would change his assessment. And without the Electress, they would be spoken of even less. For Sophia, she was not yet Electress in 1676, but Leibniz was writing retrospectively, proved to be exactly the intellectual companion Leibniz had been seeking. At 46 years old, Sophia was mature, well-educated, intellectually curious, and starved for the kind of philosophical conversation that Leibniz could provide. Their first meetings were probably somewhat tentative. Sophia was a duchess, a woman of high rank, and there were protocols to observe. Leibniz was a commoner, an employee of her husband, though his learning gave him a certain status. But as they talked, and they discovered a remarkable compatibility of minds. Sophia had read widely in philosophy. She was familiar with the works of René Descartes, who had died in 1650, but whose philosophy dominated much of 17th century thought. She had studied Descartes' theories about the separation of mind and body, about clear and distinct ideas, about the method of systematic doubt. She had also read Baruch Spinoza, whose philosophical system tried to explain everything, God, nature, mind, ethics, in geometric terms, as if the universe were a vast mathematical proof. But Sophia was not content merely to read philosophy. She wanted to discuss it, to ask questions, to test ideas against objections. And Leibniz, who loved nothing better than philosophical argument, was delighted to have found such a partner. And their conversations ranged across the full spectrum of philosophical questions. They discussed metaphysics. What is the fundamental nature of reality? Are minds and bodies different substances, as Descartes claimed? Or is there just one kind of substance, as Spinoza argued? What are the basic building blocks of the universe? They discussed epistemology. How do we know what we know? Can we trust our senses? Or do they deceive us? Are there innate ideas that we're born with? Or does all knowledge come from experience? They discussed theology. How can we reconcile the existence of evil with belief in an all-powerful, all-good God? What is the relationship between faith and reason? What happens to the soul after death? They discussed ethics. What makes actions right or wrong? Is virtue its own reward? Or should we be motivated by hope of heaven and fear of hell? How should a good person live? These were not casual conversations. Both Sophia and Leibniz took philosophy seriously, believing that these questions mattered profoundly for how one understood the world and lived one's life. Their discussions were rigorous, analytical, and sometimes contentious when they disagreed. One of their early disputes concerned the nature of the soul. Leibniz argued that the soul was a simple, indivisible unity, what he called a monad. According to Leibniz's metaphysics, the universe was composed of infinitely many monads, each a simple substance without parts. The soul was a particularly sophisticated kind of monad, capable of perception and thought. But Sophia challenged this view. In letters that have survived, we can see her making what philosophers would call a materialist argument. She suggested that mental phenomena might be more complex and more dependent on physical processes than Leibniz wanted to admit. Drawing an analogy from money, she wrote, "In matters of money, one unity is not worth as much as thousands, although in us, you want this to be everything." Leibniz responded with careful arguments defending his position, and the exchange continued over several letters. Modern scholars who have analyzed this correspondence note that while Leibniz's philosophical system was more fully developed, Sophia was not merely asking him to explain his views. She was actively participating in philosophical debate, offering her own theories and defending them with logical arguments. As their friendship deepened through the late 1670s, Sophia and Leibniz also exchanged views on more practical matters. They gossiped about court life, shared observations about the people around them, and discussed current events. Leibniz clearly valued Sophia's political judgment as well as her philosophical acumen. In 1680, when Sophia was 50 years old, she undertook a remarkable project. Ernest Augustus was away on one of his frequent military campaigns, and Sophia found herself with time and solitude. She decided to write her memoirs, covering the first 50 years of her life from her birth in The Hague through her marriage and her early years in Hanover. This was an extraordinary undertaking for a woman of her time. While some noble women kept diaries and many wrote letters, full autobiographical memoirs were rare. Sophia's work was written in French, the language of culture and diplomacy, and it demonstrated the same clear intelligence that characterized her philosophical correspondence. In her memoirs, Sophia wrote candidly about her childhood neglect by her mother. She preferred the sight of her monkeys to us, about her education at Leiden, about the smallpox that had scarred her face, made a great breach in my beauty, about her marriage negotiations, and about her early years with Ernest Augustus. She wrote with wry humor, sharp observations, and refreshing honesty. She didn't romanticize her childhood or flatter herself, but neither did she dwell excessively on her misfortunes. The memoirs reveal a woman of considerable psychological insight and literary talent, and Sophia understood herself and the people around her with remarkable clarity. She could laugh at her own foibles while also acknowledging her genuine accomplishments, and she wrote prose that was clear, elegant, and engaging. Her memoirs are a pleasure to read, full of vivid details and clever turns of phrase. Leibniz almost certainly read Sophia's memoirs, and he must have been impressed by her literary skill, as well as her philosophical abilities. Here was confirmation, if any were needed, that Sophia was an intellectual in her own right, not merely a patron who provided funds for scholars. The friendship between Sophia and Leibniz would last for 38 years, from 1676 until Sophia's death in 1714. They corresponded when apart and conversed when together, and their letters filled volumes. Modern editions of their philosophical correspondence run to hundreds of pages. But their relationship was not merely intellectual. They also shared a genuine personal affection. Leibniz admired Sophia's mind, but he also enjoyed her company, her wit, her perspective on life. Sophia valued Leibniz's brilliance, but she also appreciated his friendship, his willingness to take her seriously as a thinker, his loyalty over decades. In later years, after Sophia became Electress and then heir to the British throne, Leibniz would serve as an important political advisor, as well as an intellectual companion. But in these early years of the 1670s and 80s, their relationship was primarily about the life of the mind, about exploring ideas, testing arguments, seeking truth through reason and discussion. As Sophia entered her 50s in the 1680s, she had established herself as a respected figure at the Hanover court and beyond. Her 7 surviving children were growing into adolescence and young adulthood, each requiring attention and guidance as they prepared for their own futures. Her intellectual life with Leibniz continued to flourish, providing her with the stimulation and companionship that made court life bearable. And her marriage to Ernest Augustus, while not passionate, had settled into a comfortable partnership based on mutual respect and shared interests in their family's advancement. But the 1680s would bring both triumphs and tragedies that would test Sophia's resilience in ways she could not have anticipated. Her eldest son, George Louis, had grown into a serious, responsible young man, and he had received an excellent education, trained in military arts as befitted a prince who would need to lead armies, and had been carefully prepared for his future role as head of the family. Sophia was proud of him, describing him in her letters as conscientious and dutiful. But George Louis lacked his mother's warmth and intellectual curiosity. He was a capable administrator and soldier, but not a man of culture or learning. In 1682, when George Louis was 22 years old, marriage negotiations began in earnest. The bride selected was Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the daughter of George William, Ernest Augustus's brother, who had given up his own prospects for marriage to allow Ernest Augustus to marry and produce heirs. This marriage was complicated from the beginning. George William had never formally married Sophia Dorothea's mother, Eleanor d'Amier d'Olbreuse. Eleanor had been a French lady-in-waiting, not of royal blood, and George William had lived with her as his mistress for years before finally legitimizing their daughter to make the marriage to George Louis possible. Sophia was initially opposed to the match. She looked down on Eleanor's non-royal origins, reportedly describing her in private correspondence as mouse dirt mixed among the pepper, a crude but vivid metaphor expressing Sophia's belief that Eleanor's common blood contaminated the noble bloodlines being mixed through this marriage. Sophia was also concerned about Sophia Dorothea's legitimated rather than naturally legitimate status, worrying that this irregularity might cause problems later. But Ernest Augustus saw enormous financial advantages in the match. George William was willing to provide a substantial dowry, and more importantly, he agreed to make George Louis his heir to the rich territories of Celle. The consolidation of Hanover and Celle would create a much more powerful state with greater income and prestige. The political and economic logic was overwhelming. Eventually, Sophia was persuaded by these practical considerations. The marriage took place on November 21st, 1682, with appropriate ceremony. George Louis was 22, and his bride Sophia Dorothea was just 16 years old, a nervous girl being married to a man she barely knew. From the beginning, the marriage was troubled. George Louis found his young wife unsophisticated and lacking in the refinement he expected, as Sophia Dorothea found her husband cold, remote, and uninterested in her company. They had no common interests, no shared intellectual pursuits, no basis for companionship beyond their dynastic obligations, but they did fulfill their primary duty. On November 10, 1683, Sophia Dorothea gave birth to a son. Named George Augustus, Sophia became a grandmother at age 53, and the succession was further secured. The baby was healthy and strong, and both Hanover and Chelles celebrated the birth of an heir who would one day unite both territories. 3 years later, on March 16, 1687, Sophia Dorothea gave birth to a daughter, also named Sophia Dorothea. With 2 children born, the couple had fulfilled their dynastic obligations, but their marriage continued to deteriorate. George Louis spent less and less time with his wife, preferring the company of his military companions and increasingly his mistresses. George Louis had taken as his principal mistress a woman named Melusine von der Schulenburg, who was tall, thin, and apparently possessed a sharp intelligence that appealed to George Louis, even if beauty did not. The English, when they later met her, would mockingly call her the Maypole because of her height and thinness, but George Louis valued her counsel and kept her by his side for decades, eventually having 3 daughters with her. Sophia Dorothea, humiliated by her husband's open infidelity and miserable in her loveless marriage, began seeking comfort elsewhere. By 1689, she had met a Swedish nobleman named Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, and who served as an officer in the Hanoverian Guard. Königsmarck was everything George Louis was not: charming, romantic, attentive, and apparently genuinely attracted to the lonely young princess. What began as flirtation deepened into an affair. Sophia Dorothea and Königsmarck met secretly, exchanged passionate letters, and apparently began planning to run away together. If they could reach Königsmarck's family estates in Sweden, they believed, they would be beyond the reach of the Hanoverian court. But conducting a secret affair in a court where everyone watched everyone else proved impossible. Servants gossiped, courtiers noticed unexplained absences, and eventually word reached Ernest Augustus and George Louis. The scandal threatened not just the marriage, but the entire carefully constructed political alliance between Hanover and Chelles. What happened next remains murky, shrouded in deliberate obscurity and destroyed records. On July 1st, 1694, Count Königsmarck disappeared. He was last seen entering the Leine Schloss late in the evening. He never left. His body was never found. No explanation was ever given, and no one was ever officially charged with any crime. The universal assumption, both at the time and among historians since, is that Königsmarck was murdered on the orders of either Ernest Augustus or George Louis, or both. His body was probably dismembered and buried somewhere on the palace grounds, or thrown into the river Leine. The murder was kept quiet, and the servants who carried it out were sworn to secrecy, or eliminated themselves, and the official position was that Königsmarck had simply left Hanover. Sophia Dorothea was interrogated, and her affair was revealed through the letters that had been intercepted. On December 28, 1694, her marriage to George Louis was dissolved by decree. The grounds were her adultery, and the divorce was absolute. But Sophia Dorothea would pay an extraordinarily heavy price for her indiscretion. She was taken to Alden House, a castle in Chelles, and imprisoned there. She would remain a prisoner for the next 32 years, until her death in 1726. She was never allowed to see her children again. Her son George Augustus was 7 years old when his mother disappeared from his life, and her daughter Sophia Dorothea was just 7 as well. The children were told their mother was dead, and they grew up believing themselves motherless. Sophia's role in this scandal and its brutal resolution is difficult to assess from the surviving records. As George Louis's mother, and as a grandmother who loved her grandchildren, she must have been appalled by the scandal and the pain it caused. The affair threatened everything the family had worked for: the alliance with Chelles, the family's reputation, the children's legitimacy, On the other hand, Sophia was a woman of considerable compassion and intelligence. She understood unhappy marriages, having watched many such unions at various courts. She must have had some sympathy for her young daughter-in-law, trapped in a loveless marriage to a cold husband who openly kept mistresses. And she surely grieved for her grandchildren, who lost their mother and would grow up with the shame and confusion of knowing she had been divorced and imprisoned. Sophia maintained contact with her granddaughter throughout the girl's life, showing that family ties remained important even when strained by scandal. She ensured that young Sophia Dorothea received a proper education and was eventually able to make a good marriage herself. But the imprisonment of Sophia Dorothea of Chell would remain a stain on the family's honor, whispered about in courts across Europe. While this domestic drama unfolded, larger political events were reshaping Sophia's position. Ernest Augustus had spent decades carefully cultivating his relationship with the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. He had provided troops for imperial campaigns, had supported Habsburg interests in the complex diplomacy of German politics, and had demonstrated his loyalty through both military service and financial contributions. The Emperor, Leopold I, had the power to create new electorates, to elevate certain princes to the status of electors, giving them the right to vote in the election of future emperors. There were originally 7 electors, but by the late 17th century, an 8th had been created, and Leopold was considering creating a 9th. Ernest Augustus lobbied hard for this honor. He argued that his territories, while not enormous, were strategically important. He emphasized his military contributions and his unwavering support for the Catholic emperor, despite being Protestant himself, and he was willing to pay substantial sums of money, effectively bribes, though this was never stated openly, to smooth the way. On December 19th, 1692, the official decree arrived. The Duchy of Brunswick-Luneburg was elevated to an electorate. Ernest Augustus was now Elector Ernest Augustus, one of the 9 princes with the right to elect the Holy Roman Emperor, and Sophia, his wife, became Electress Sophia of Hanover, the title by which she would be best remembered for the rest of her life and throughout history. The elevation was a tremendous triumph. Ernest Augustus had risen from being a landless younger son to being one of the most important princes in Germany. The achievement required decades of patient work, political skill, military service, and financial investment, but it had paid off. Hanover was now a first-ranked German state. For Sophia, the change in status brought both benefits and responsibilities. As Electress, she ranked above mere duchesses and even above many queens in the complex hierarchy of European nobility. When she attended imperial gatherings or received foreign visitors, she was entitled to precedence and deference. Her opinions carried more weight. Her correspondence was more eagerly sought. Her patronage more valuable. She took her new position seriously. She presided over the court at Hanover with increased formality and ceremony. She expanded her patronage of arts and learning, attracting scholars, musicians, and artists to Hanover. She supervised extensive improvements to the Herrenhausen Palace and Gardens, transforming them into a showcase worthy of an electoral court. The Great Garden at Herrenhausen, and which Sophia had begun developing in the 1680s, became even more ambitious after 1692. She commissioned additional fountains, more elaborate parterres, longer tree-lined avenues. The great fountain was enhanced to shoot water even higher into the air. Sculptures were commissioned from leading artists. The garden theatre was constructed, allowing for outdoor performances during the summer months. Sophia walked in her gardens almost every day, regardless of weather. She supervised the work of the head gardeners, suggested improvements, and took personal pride in every aspect of the design. "The garden is my life," she told visitors, and it was not mere rhetoric. The gardens represented her taste, her vision, her desire to create something beautiful and enduring that would outlast her mortal life. Her intellectual life continued to flourish as well. Leibniz remained at court, and their philosophical correspondence deepened. After 1692, when Sophia became Electress, Leibniz also began serving as a political advisor, helping Ernest Augustus navigate the complex diplomacy of the Holy Roman Empire. But the friendship between Leibniz and Sophia remained primarily intellectual, focused on philosophical questions rather than politics. Sophia's daughter, also named Sophia Charlotte, had inherited her mother's love of learning and philosophical discussion. In 1684, Sophia Charlotte had married Frederick of Hohenzollern, who would eventually become King Frederick I in Prussia. Mother and daughter corresponded regularly, and when Frederick established his court in Berlin, as Sophia Charlotte created an intellectual circle there, modelled on what she had experienced in Hanover. Leibniz spent considerable time at the Prussian court as well, and he corresponded with both mother and daughter about philosophical questions. The relationship between Leibniz and the two Sophies, as scholars would later call them, became one of the most interesting intellectual friendships of the age. Sophia Charlotte shared her mother's interest in the problem of evil and divine justice. How could an all-powerful, all-good God allow so much suffering in the world? If God created everything, didn't that make God responsible for evil? These questions had troubled philosophers and theologians for centuries, and they seemed particularly pressing in an age that had just experienced the horrors of the 30 Years' War. Our Leibniz developed his answer in a philosophical work called Theodicy, which attempted to justify God's ways to humanity. His central argument was that God had created the best possible world. Not a perfect world, which was impossible, but the best world that could exist given the constraints of logic and the requirement for human free will. Evil existed, Leibniz argued, but a world with some evil and human freedom was better than a world without freedom where evil was impossible. Sophia and Sophia Charlotte both engaged deeply with these ideas, offering objections and counter-arguments. Some of their challenges were theological. How can we be sure this is the best possible world? How do we know what God's purposes are? Other challenges were more philosophical. What exactly does best mean when applied to an entire world? How do we measure such things? These conversations shaped Leibniz's thinking and found their way into his published work. When Theodicy finally appeared in 1710, it bore the mark of decades of discussion with the two Sophies. But the 1690s also brought profound personal losses to Sophia. In 1690, her son Charles Philip died in battle. He was serving as a colonel in the Imperial Army when he was killed in combat. He was only 21 years old, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, cut down in one of the endless wars that plagued 17th century Europe. Then, in 1691, came an even more devastating blow. Frederick Augustus, Sophia's second son, was killed at the siege of Philipsburg. He too was serving in the Imperial Army, there having risen to the rank of general despite being only 30 years old. The siege was part of the 9 Years' War, one of the many conflicts between France and a coalition of European powers. Frederick Augustus was killed in the fighting, and his body was brought back to Hanover for burial. For Sophia, the loss of two sons to military service was agonizing. She had raised them, educated them, watched them grow from infants into men. She had sent them off to military careers knowing the risks, but hoping that somehow they would survive. When death claimed them both within a year of each other, the pain was almost unbearable. As a mother, Sophia had little choice but to accept military careers for her younger sons. The eldest, George Louis, would inherit the electorate, but the younger sons needed careers, and in noble families, and that generally meant either the military or the church. Frederick Augustus and Charles Philip had both chosen the army, and both had died serving the emperor. Sophia's grief found expression in letters to friends and family. She did not rage against fate or question God's will. That was not her style, but her pain was evident in every line. She had lost children before. Several had died in infancy, but losing adult sons who had become their own people, who had lives and careers and futures, was different. The grief was compounded by the knowledge that they had died violent deaths far from home, on battlefields in pursuit of someone else's political goals. On January 23rd, 1698, Ernest Augustus died at Herrenhausen. He was 68 years old and had been in declining health for some time. He died in the palace he had helped to improve, surrounded by family, having achieved the great ambition of his life, the elevation of his house to electoral status. Sophia was now a widow at the age of 67. She and Ernest Augustus had been married for nearly 40 years. From 1658 to 1698, it had not been a romantic love match, but it had been a successful partnership. They had produced 7 children who survived to adulthood, had raised their family status dramatically, and had created a secure position for their descendants. In the days after Ernest Augustus's death, as the household went into formal mourning and preparations were made for the funeral, Sophia wrote a letter that revealed both her pain and her remarkable strength of character. Responding to condolences from friends, and she wrote, "One does not die of grief, or I would have done so long ago." It was a stark statement, acknowledging all the losses she had endured over her nearly 7 decades of life. Her father had died when she was 2. She had lost brothers and sisters throughout childhood. 2 of her sons had been killed in military service. Her beloved daughter, Sophia Charlotte, though still alive in 1698, would die young in 1705. Her husband had frequent affairs with mistresses. She had endured the scandal of her son's divorce and the imprisonment of her daughter-in-law. And now she was a widow, alone in her late 60s. But Sophia was not given to self-pity. She had survived everything life had thrown at her, and she would survive this too. She was no longer the Electress. That position now belonged to George Lewis's future wife, when he should remarry, though he never did. But she was the Dowager Electress, still respected, still influential, still a force at court. George Lewis succeeded his father as Elector of Hanover. At 37, he was mature and experienced, having served in military campaigns and having been carefully prepared for this role. He was a capable administrator and a reasonably competent military commander, but he lacked his mother's intellectual brilliance and his father's political charm. He was dutiful rather than inspiring, competent rather than exceptional. Sophia remained at Herrenhausen. After Ernest Augustus's death, the palace was her home. The gardens were her creation, and she had no intention of retiring to some quiet dower house in the countryside. She continued to walk daily in the gardens, continued her correspondence with Leibniz and other intellectuals, continued to receive visitors, and maintain her position in European aristocratic society. But life as a dowager was different from life as a reigning duchess or electress. Sophia no longer had the same authority in household decisions. George Louis was now in charge, and while he respected his mother and consulted her on important matters, the final decisions were his to make. Sophia filled her days with reading, writing letters, philosophical discussions, and garden management. She was 68 years old in 1698, an age when many people of her era were either dead or in severe decline. But Sophia remained vigorous and alert. She walked several miles each day through her gardens. She read extensively: philosophy, theology, history, memoirs, letters. She wrote prolifically, maintaining correspondence with relatives, friends, and intellectuals across Europe. Then, in July 1700, news arrived from England that would change everything. On July 30th, William, Duke of Gloucester, died at Windsor Castle. He was only 11 years old, and his death created a constitutional crisis that would ultimately lead to Sophia becoming heir to the British throne. To understand why the death of one young prince mattered so much, we need to step back and look at the complex situation of the English succession in 1700. King William III, who ruled England, Scotland and Ireland, was childless. His wife, Queen Mary II, and had died in 1694 without producing any surviving children. William was aging and in poor health, unlikely to remarry and produce new heirs. When William died, the crown would pass to his sister-in-law, Princess Anne of Denmark. But Anne, though she had been pregnant 17 times, had lost almost all her children to miscarriage, stillbirth, or childhood disease. Only one child had survived past infancy, William, Duke of Gloucester, born in 1689. The boy had been sickly from birth, suffering from what was probably hydrocephalus, water on the brain, but he had survived to age 11, giving hope that he might reach adulthood and eventually produce heirs of his own. When the Duke of Gloucester died in July 1700, that hope died with him. Anne was 35 years old and in poor health, and her body broken by 17 failed pregnancies. The chances of her having another child, much less a child who would survive to adulthood, were essentially zero. This meant that when Anne died, the crown would pass to whom exactly? The nearest heir by blood was James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of the deposed King James II. But James Francis Edward was Catholic, raised at the French court in exile, and absolutely unacceptable to the Protestant English Parliament. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had occurred precisely to prevent Catholic rule. When James II had tried to re-Catholicize England, Parliament had invited his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William to invade and take the throne. And the Bill of Rights of 1689 had explicitly stated that no Catholic could rule England. Parliament was not about to allow a Catholic succession now. But if Catholics were excluded, who should succeed? There were 57 people with closer blood ties to the English throne than Sophia, but almost all of them were either Catholic themselves or married to Catholics, which the Bill of Rights also prohibited. Sophia's claim came through her mother, Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I. Elizabeth had been James's eldest daughter. His son Charles became King Charles I, who was executed in 1649. Charles's sons became King Charles II and King James II, but both lines had either died out or converted to Catholicism. Of Elizabeth Stuart's 13 children, and only a few had surviving descendants in 1700. Many of Elizabeth's children had converted to Catholicism or had married Catholics, which excluded them. Others had died without children. Sophia was the youngest of Elizabeth's daughters, but she was the most senior Protestant descendant still alive. In September 1700, Sophia received an invitation that must have seemed extraordinary. King William III invited her to come to Hetloo Palace in Apeldoorn, in the Netherlands, for a personal meeting. The purpose was clear. William wanted to assess Sophia as a potential heir to his throne. The meeting must have been strange for both parties. William was Sophia's cousin, through the complicated web of 17th century royal relationships. He was 50 years old, and worn down by years of warfare against France and by the political intrigues of managing 3 kingdoms. He was also in declining health, suffering from asthma and the lingering effects of various injuries and illnesses. Sophia, at 70 years old, was actually older than William, which made her an unusual choice for an heir. Most succession planning tried to ensure a young heir who could rule for decades and produce the next generation. Sophia might become queen, but she would be elderly, and her reign would necessarily be short. But Sophia had one tremendous advantage. She had living Protestant heirs. Her eldest son, George Louis, was 40 years old, healthy, and had already produced an heir of his own, George Augustus. The succession would be secure for at least 2 generations, perhaps 3. Anne Sophia's Protestant credentials were impeccable. She had been raised in the Reformed tradition, had never wavered in her faith, and had instilled strong Protestant beliefs in all her children. The meeting at Het Loo went well. William found Sophia intelligent, dignified, and acceptable. Importantly, she could speak Dutch fluently, having grown up in the Netherlands, which allowed them to converse easily in William's native language. They discussed politics, religion, and family. William came away convinced that Sophia and her line were the best solution to the succession problem. Back in London, Parliament debated the issue throughout 1601. Some members argued for bringing Sophia to England immediately, so she could become familiar with the country and be ready to assume power when William died. Others worried about offending Queen Anne, who would reign before Sophia and who was known to be sensitive about discussions of her eventual successor. There was also the practical problem of Sophia's age. She was 70 years old in 1701. Anne was 36. While Anne was in poor health and Sophia was remarkably vigorous for her age, it was quite possible that Sophia would die before Anne, leaving the succession unsettled once again. But Parliament decided that Sophia represented the best available option. On June 12, 1701, the Act of Settlement was passed into law. King William III gave his royal assent, and the succession to the English throne was legally settled. The Act declared, in the event of no legitimate issue from Anne or William III, and the crowns of England and Ireland were to settle upon the most excellent Princess Sophia, Electress and Duchess Dowager of Hanover, and the heirs of her body being Protestant. The language was formal and legalistic, but its meaning was revolutionary. Parliament was exercising its power to choose the monarch, setting aside dozens of people with better hereditary claims in favour of religious requirements. All Catholics were excluded, as were Protestants who had married Catholics. The throne would go to Sophia and her Protestant descendants, bypassing anyone with closer blood ties who failed the religious test. The Act also imposed new restrictions on the monarchy, continuing the constitutional revolution that had begun with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Future monarchs would have to join in communion with the Church of England. They could not wage war for the defence of territories not belonging to the English crown without Parliament's consent. Judges would hold office on good behaviour rather than at the monarch's pleasure. Various other provisions limited royal power and strengthened parliamentary authority. When news of the Act reached Sophia in Hanover, she must have felt a mixture of astonishment, pride, and apprehension. At 70 years old, she had suddenly become heir presumptive to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. If she could outlive both William III and Queen Anne, and at her age, that was far from certain, she would become Queen Sophia of England, Scotland, and Ireland. It was an extraordinary turn of fate for a woman who had been born the 12th child of exiled royalty, raised in modest circumstances in the Netherlands, scarred by smallpox, and married off to a younger son with no real prospects. Through a combination of longevity, Protestant faith, and the accidents of birth and death that had eliminated so many other claimants, Sophia now stood just 2 lives away from a crown. The Act of Settlement would prove to be one of the most important pieces of legislation in British constitutional history. To this day, the British monarch must be a Protestant descendant of Sophia of Hanover. The current King Charles III is her direct descendant, as was his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. Every British monarch since 1714 has been a Protestant heir of Sophia's body, exactly as the Act specified. But in 1701, as Sophia received the news and contemplated what it might mean, the future was uncertain. Would she live long enough to inherit? Would Queen Anne accept her graciously? Or would there be tension and conflict? How would the English people react to a 70-year-old German princess becoming their queen? These questions remained unanswered as Sophia entered her 8th decade of life with a crown dangling before her, tantalizingly close, yet still beyond reach. The early months of 1702 brought significant changes. On March 8th, King William III died after falling from his horse. William had been inspecting his favorite residence at Hampton Court when his horse stumbled on a molehill. William was thrown, broke his collarbone, and though the injury did not seem immediately life-threatening, complications developed. He died 2 weeks later, aged 51. Princess Anne succeeded William as Queen Anne, ruler of England and Ireland. The crowns of Scotland remained technically separate at this point. Scotland had its own parliament and its own succession laws, but Anne was also proclaimed Queen of Scotland under Scottish law. The union of the crowns continued, but the kingdoms remained legally distinct. With William's death, Sophia moved up in the succession. She was now just one life away from the throne, Anne's life. And Anne, though 35 years younger than Sophia, was in terrible health. Her 17 pregnancies had destroyed her body. She suffered from gout so severe that she often had to be carried in a chair rather than walking. She was overweight, frequently ill, and clearly not long for this world. Observers across Europe began making calculations. Sophia was 71 years old in 1702, an extraordinarily advanced age. Anne was 37, but her health was so poor that betting men in London were taking wagers on which woman would die first. The odds fluctuated based on the latest reports of each woman's health, but increasingly, people believed that Sophia might actually outlive Anne despite the 3-decade age difference. Some English politicians began agitating more insistently for Sophia to come to England. They argued that the heir to the throne should be in the country, familiar with English customs and politics, ready to assume power immediately if Anne died suddenly. There were practical concerns. Anne's Catholic half-brother, James Francis Edward Stuart, called the Pretender by his enemies and King James III by his supporters, was living in France, much closer to London than Hanover. If Anne died without warning, there might be a dangerous window during which the Catholic claimant could try to seize power. But Anne was adamantly, violently opposed to Sophia coming to England. The Queen found any mention of her successor deeply painful and offensive. She did not want to see this healthy, vigorous old woman who would inherit her crown when she died. She did not want a rival court in her kingdom, with ambitious politicians and courtiers gravitating toward the rising sun of the heir, rather than the setting sun of the current monarch. Anne's feelings were understandable, even if they were politically inconvenient. She had lost all 17 of her children. She had no heirs of her body, and every day she lived with the knowledge that her line would end with her death. Seeing Sophia, who had 7 surviving children and numerous grandchildren, a woman visibly blessed with fertility and longevity, would have been emotionally devastating. Moreover, Anne remembered the last years of William III's reign, when she had been heir presumptive. William had treated her coldly, suspecting, probably correctly, that Anne was in correspondence with the exiled Stuart court. The two had never reconciled, and William had died without seeing Anne again. Now Anne was queen, and she was determined not to be haunted by her own successor the way William had been haunted by his. so the proposal to bring Sophia to England was firmly rejected. Anne made her feelings clear to Parliament. Sophia and her family would not be invited to England during Anne's lifetime. Any suggestion to the contrary would be taken as an insult to the crown. Sophia accepted this decision with outward grace, though she must have been disappointed. She had never visited England, the country she might someday rule. She knew it only through books, letters, and the accounts of travellers. She was curious about English culture, about the English people, about the land from which her grandmother Elizabeth Stuart had come. But if Anne forbade it, Sophia had no choice but to comply. Instead, Sophia remained in Hanover, maintaining her gardens, corresponding with Leibniz and other intellectuals, and keeping herself meticulously informed about English politics. She read English newspapers, received regular reports from correspondents in London, and studied the complex factional divisions that characterized Anne's reign. English politics in the early 18th century was dominated by two groups, the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs generally supported parliamentary power, religious tolerance for Protestants, though not for Catholics, commercial interests, and the Hanoverian succession. The Tories leaned toward royal prerogative, the established Church of England, landed interests, and some Tories secretly harboured Jacobite sympathies, support for the Stuart claimant. Sophia naturally aligned with the Whigs, who were her strongest supporters, but she tried to avoid open partisanship, understanding that if she became queen, she would need to work with all political factions. She wrote carefully worded letters to English correspondents, expressing her loyalty to Queen Anne and her respect for English constitutional traditions, while also making clear her readiness to serve if called upon. In 1705, Parliament passed the Sophia Naturalisation Act, which granted British nationality to Sophia and all her Protestant descendants. This removed any objection that Sophia was a foreigner who had no right to the English throne. She was now legally British, though she had never set foot in Britain. Her children and grandchildren were also British subjects, ensuring that the succession would be smooth. But the same year brought devastating personal loss. On February 1st, 1705, Sophia received terrible news from Berlin. Her beloved daughter, Sophia Charlotte, had died suddenly at the age of 36. Sophia Charlotte had been visiting her mother in Hanover when she fell ill with pneumonia. The disease progressed rapidly, and within days, the young queen in Prussia was dead. She died at Hanover, in her childhood home, surrounded by family but far too young. For Sophia, the loss was almost unbearable. Sophia Charlotte had been her favorite child, the daughter who shared her intellectual interests and philosophical curiosity. They had corresponded regularly, had discussed philosophy and literature, had maintained a closeness that transcended the usual formal relationships between royal mothers and daughters. Sophia Charlotte had created her own intellectual salon in Berlin, had patronized Leibniz and other scholars, and had become a notable intellectual figure in her own right. Now she was gone, leaving behind a heartbroken husband and children who would grow up without their mother. Sophia, at 74, was burying her daughter, a reversal of natural order that felt profoundly wrong. Caroline of Ansbach, who had been Sophia Charlotte's ward and protégée, was also devastated. Caroline had been educated by Sophia Charlotte and had considered her a beloved mentor and almost a second mother. In her grief, Caroline wrote to Leibniz, "The calamity has overwhelmed me with grief and sickness, and it is only the hope that I may soon follow her that consoles me." Leibniz, too, mourned deeply. He had carried on philosophical correspondence with both Sophias, and Sophia Charlotte's death robbed him of one of his most valued intellectual companions. He wrote a moving tribute to her memory, praising her intelligence, her curiosity, and her genuine love of philosophy. For Sophia, the months after her daughter's death were difficult. She continued her daily walks in the gardens, continued her correspondence, continued to fulfill her duties as Dowager Electress, but something had dimmed. The future she had imagined, becoming Queen of England with her beloved daughter nearby, creating an intellectual court in London modelled on what they had built in Hanover and Berlin, now seemed hollow. Even if the crown came to her, Sophia Charlotte would not be there to share it. The years from 1705 to 1714 were years of waiting, watching, and hoping. Sophia was now well into her 70s, an age when most people of her era had been dead for years or were confined to bed with various ailments. But Sophia remained remarkably healthy and active. She walked miles every day through her gardens. She maintained a voluminous correspondence. She read extensively and continued her philosophical discussions with Leibniz, who remained at court. Queen Anne's health, by contrast, continued to deteriorate. Reports from London told of a queen who was increasingly confined to her apartments, unable to walk without assistance, suffering from gout, dropsy, and various other ailments. Anne was in constant pain, frequently feverish, and obviously failing. Medical practitioners of the era could do little beyond administering painkillers and trying various ineffective treatments. The contrast between the two women became increasingly stark, and Anne was 35 years younger than Sophia, but seemed decades older in terms of health and vigour. Observers commented on the irony. The elderly heir might well outlive the relatively young queen. In 1707, the Act of Union was passed, merging the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland into a single Kingdom of Great Britain. Scotland gave up its separate parliament and sent representatives to Westminster instead. In return, Scotland gained access to English trade routes and colonies, religious guarantees for the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, and assurance that the Hanoverian succession would apply to Scotland as well as England. This was important for Sophia because it meant that if she inherited, she would be Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, not just England and Ireland. The succession was now legally settled throughout the British Isles. In 1711, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland officially recommended that Presbyterian congregations pray regularly for the Princess Sophia, Electress, and Duchess Dowager of Hanover, and the Protestant line in that family, upon whom the succession to the crown of these dominions is by law established. It was an extraordinary gesture. Churches across Scotland were praying for Sophia every Sunday, asking God to preserve her life and bring her safely to the throne. Sophia must have found this both gratifying and strange, to be prayed for by millions of people she had never met, in a country she had never visited, for a position she might never live to occupy. But the prayers from Scotland also increased tension with Queen Anne, and Anne heard about these prayers and was deeply offended. From her perspective, it seemed like her subjects were praying for her to die so that Sophia could replace her. The distinction between praying for the successor's preservation and praying for the current monarch's demise was probably too subtle for Anne in her pain and illness. The political situation in England became increasingly complex and contentious during Anne's reign. The War of Spanish Succession dragged on for years, draining the treasury and causing political divisions. The Whigs and Tories fought for control of Parliament and influence over the Queen. Secret negotiations with the exiled Stuart court continued, with some Tories keeping their options open in case the Jacobite restoration seemed likely. Sophia tried to stay above these partisan battles, but it was difficult. The Whigs were her natural allies and strongest supporters. The Tories included many Jacobite sympathizers who would prefer a Stuart restoration to a Hanoverian succession. Sophia had to maintain relationships with both factions without appearing to favor one over the other too openly. There was also the question of Sophia's heir, her son George Louis. English politicians wanted to meet him, to assess whether he would be an acceptable king if Sophia died before inheriting or shortly after becoming queen. But George Louis was reluctant to go to England, partly because his mother couldn't go and he didn't want to seem too eager, partly because he worried about making enemies through political missteps. Some politicians suggested that Sophia's grandson George Augustus might visit England instead. And George Augustus had married Caroline of Ansbach in 1705, the same Caroline who had been educated by Sophia Charlotte and who had been present at Sophia's daughter's death. Caroline was charming, intelligent, well-educated, and would make an excellent future queen. Surely Anne could accept a visit from the second generation of heirs, but Anne rejected this idea as firmly as she had rejected Sophia's visit. In 1714, when the suggestion was raised again, Anne responded with fury. She sent a sharp letter to Hanover, making clear that no member of the Hanoverian family would be permitted in England during her lifetime. The letter warned that such conduct will certainly be productive of consequences prejudicial to the succession itself, which has no security except while the sovereign who actually wears the crown retains her rights. It was a remarkable statement. Anne was essentially saying that she would undermine the very succession that Parliament had legally established if Sophia's family defied her wishes. Whether Anne actually had the power to do this was questionable, but the threat was clear. This letter arrived at Hanover on June 5th, 1714. Sophia, now 83 years old, had been waiting for 13 years to inherit the English throne. 13 years of careful diplomacy, of measured letters, of patience and hope. And now Queen Anne was threatening the entire arrangement because someone had suggested that Sophia's grandson might visit England. According to the Countess of Buckeburg, who recorded the event in a letter to Sophia's niece, and the letter from Anne made Sophia feel ill. For 3 days, she wasn't quite herself, troubled by the Queen's words and the implications they carried. All those years of waiting, of hoping, of maintaining good relations with English politicians, had it all been for nothing? Would Anne find some way to undo the act of settlement at the last moment? Sophia had survived so much in her long life. She had survived childhood neglect and exile. She had survived smallpox. She had survived the deaths of her father, her husband, 2 sons, and her beloved daughter. She had survived political upheavals, family scandals, wars, and personal disappointments. But this final obstacle, Anne's jealous determination to keep her from England, seemed almost insurmountable. For 3 days, Sophia worried and fretted, but on June 8, 1714, she felt much better. She came down for dinner, ate well, and seemed to have recovered her usual spirits. The household relaxed, relieved that the Dowager Electress had weathered this latest stress. After dinner, Sophia decided to take her customary walk in the gardens at Herrenhausen. It was a beautiful early summer evening, warm but not hot, with the gardens in full bloom. Sophia had walked these paths thousands of times over the decades. She knew every turn, every fountain, every vista. The garden was her creation, her life's work, the physical manifestation of her taste and vision. She set out with some companions, including her granddaughter-in-law Caroline of Ansbach, who had become close to Sophia in the years since Sophia Charlotte's death. They strolled through the geometric parterres, up past the fountains sending water sparkling into the evening air, along the tree-lined avenues that stretched toward the horizon. Then, without warning, the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and suddenly rain began to fall. Not a gentle sprinkle, but a heavy downpour, the kind of summer thunderstorm that drenches everything within seconds. Sophia, caught by surprise in the middle of the garden, began to run toward the nearest shelter, a covered arcade or pavilion where she could wait out the storm. Caroline and the other attendants ran with her, all of them holding up their skirts and hurrying toward cover. But Sophia never made it to shelter. Just as she reached the arcade, she suddenly collapsed. Caroline, who was close behind, caught the elderly Electress in her arms. Sophia's eyes were open but unseeing. Her breath was ragged and irregular. The attendants called for help, for physicians, for anyone who might save her. Servants came running from the palace, but it was too late. Sophia of Hanover, Dowager Electress, heir presumptive to the throne of Great Britain, died there in Caroline's arms, in the gardens she had created, 8 weeks before she would have become queen. She was 83 years old. She had lived through 8 decades of European history, had corresponded with the greatest philosopher of her age, had raised 7 children to adulthood, had created one of Europe's most beautiful gardens, had been named heir to a throne she would never occupy, and she died just steps away from shelter, brought down by a heart that finally, after 83 years, could beat no more. The news of Sophia's death spread quickly through Hanover. George Louis, who would now inherit the English throne if Anne died, took charge of the funeral arrangements. Sophia was initially laid to rest in the chapel at Leiden in Hanover, with appropriate ceremony for a woman of her rank and accomplishments. Across Europe, those who had known Sophia mourned her passing. Leibniz, who had been her friend and intellectual companion for 38 years, was devastated. He wrote that he had lost one of the few people who truly understood his philosophical work, one of the few who could challenge his ideas and make him think more deeply. The intellectual world had lost not just a patron, but a genuine philosopher. In England, the news of Sophia's death was received with mixed feelings. Some genuinely mourned a woman they had never met, but had prayed for and hoped would become their queen. Others were simply relieved that the succession question was now even clearer. George Louis would inherit whenever Anne died, with no complications about an elderly queen who might reign for only months. Queen Anne herself received the news on June 10th or 11th, depending on when the courier reached London. We have no record of her reaction. Did she feel relief that her rival was gone? Did she feel guilty that her angry letter might have contributed to Sophia's death? Did she reflect on the cruel irony that she had outlived the woman who was supposed to outlive her? We simply don't know. Anne kept her feelings private, and within weeks, she too would be dead. On August 1st, 1714, less than 2 months after Sophia's death, Queen Anne died at Kensington Palace. She was 49 years old, worn out by illness and grief. She died around 7:30 in the morning, having suffered a stroke the previous day. Her personal physician, John Arbuthnot, wrote to Jonathan Swift, "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her." With Anne's death, the succession that had been planned for 13 years finally came to pass. George Louis, Elector of Hanover, was proclaimed King George I of Great Britain and Ireland. At 54 years old, he inherited one of the most powerful thrones in Europe, the throne his mother had been denied by 8 weeks. George and his son George Augustus, who became Prince of Wales, left Hanover for England on September 16 and 1714. They sailed from the Hague, where Sophia had been born 84 years earlier, arriving at Greenwich on September 18. The next day, they made their formal ceremonial entry into London, and George was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The Jacobite supporters, those who favoured James Francis Edward Stuart, the Catholic claimant, were furious but outnumbered. A rebellion in 1715, called the First Jacobite Rebellion, attempted to restore the Stuart line, but it was quickly defeated. The Protestant succession that Parliament had established, that Sophia had waited 13 years to inherit, was secure. But George I was not well suited to be King of Britain. He spoke little English and never learned to speak it fluently, communicating instead in French or German. He was more comfortable in Hanover than in London, and returned to his German territories as often as possible. He brought with him unpopular German advisors and mistresses, which did not endear him to his new subjects. The English people found their new king strange and foreign. They missed the Stuarts, who for all their faults had at least been English. Jacobite sentiment remained strong in some regions, particularly Scotland and northern England, leading to another rebellion in 1745 that nearly succeeded. But despite these challenges, the House of Hanover established itself. George I reigned until 1727, managing to maintain the Protestant settlement and work with Parliament, even if he never became popular. His son, George II, who had spent part of his childhood with his grandmother Sophia and had absorbed more of English culture, proved a more successful king, reigning from 1727 to 1760. George III, who became king in 1760, was the first of the Hanoverian monarchs actually born in England and raised as English. His long reign from 1760 to 1820 saw the loss of the American colonies, but also the defeat of Napoleon and the expansion of the British Empire. By the time George III died in 1820, the House of Hanover was firmly established. The dynasty continued through George IV, William IV, and then Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, and Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha technically changed the dynasty's name, but every subsequent British monarch has been a direct descendant of Sophia of Hanover. King George VI, who reigned from 1936 to 1952, was Sophia's great, 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 great grandson. Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned from 1952 to 2022, was Sophia's great, 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 great granddaughter through 8 generations. King Charles III, who became king in 2022, continues this unbroken line of descent from the woman who died in a rainstorm 8 weeks before she would have been queen. The Act of Settlement of 1701 remains in effect. To this day, our British law requires that the monarch be a Protestant descendant of Sophia of Hanover, who has never been Catholic and has never married a Catholic. The succession to the Crown Act of 2013 modified some provisions, ending male preference primogeniture and allowing marriage to Catholics, but the fundamental requirement that the monarch be a Protestant descendant of Sophia remains unchanged. Estimates suggest that Sophia has more than 5,000 living descendants today, though not all are in the line of succession. The requirement that the heir be Protestant and not married to a Catholic eliminates many descendants, but Sophia's genetic legacy extends through royal families across Europe. Beyond her genetic legacy, Sophia left other monuments, and the gardens at Herrenhausen that she created became one of the most important Baroque gardens in Europe. They influenced garden design across Germany and beyond, demonstrating how art and nature could be combined into something greater than either alone. During World War II, British bombers destroyed much of Hanover, including the Herrenhausen Palace, which was completely demolished in a raid in 1943. But the gardens survived, though damaged, and were painstakingly restored after the war. Today, visitors can walk the same paths Sophia walked, see the fountains she commissioned, stand in the geometric parterres she designed. The great fountain still shoots water 80 meters into the air, one of the tallest garden fountains in Europe. The garden theatre still hosts performances during the summer. The Baroque layout remains essentially unchanged from Sophia's design. It is her most visible legacy, a testament to her vision and her belief that creating beauty was a worthwhile pursuit, even in a world of war and political intrigue. The Herrenhausen Palace itself was finally reconstructed between 2009 and 2013. Rebuilt to match the original Baroque design using old plans and images, it now houses a museum with exhibitions about Sophia, the Hanoverian dynasty, and the gardens. Visitors can learn about the Electress, who almost became queen, and see artifacts from her life. Sophia's intellectual legacy also endures. Her correspondence with Leibniz was published in the 19th century and has been studied by scholars ever since. Modern philosophy professors assign excerpts from their letters to students, illustrating how philosophical ideas develop through discussion and debate. Recent scholarship has focused on recovering the philosophical contributions of early modern women, and Sophia features prominently in this work. Books and articles analyze her arguments, her theories, and her intellectual partnership with Leibniz. She is no longer seen as merely a patron who provided funding, but as a genuine thinker who made original contributions to philosophy. Her memoirs, written in 1680, have also attracted scholarly attention. They provide a valuable first-hand account of life in 17th century European courts, of the experiences of women in aristocratic society, and of the intellectual culture of the age. Historians value her candor, her observational skills, and her literary talent. But perhaps most importantly, Sophia represents something larger than her individual achievements. She represents the power of education, intelligence, and perseverance in an age that systematically limited women's opportunities. She could not attend university, could not hold political office, could not vote or own property in her own right. Her power and influence were always mediated through men. Her husband, her sons, her position as consort, rather than ruler. Yet within those constraints, Sophia created a remarkable life. She educated herself in 7 languages, read philosophy and theology, corresponded with leading intellectuals, wrote memoirs and letters that are still read today. She patronized scholars and artists, created beautiful gardens, raised 7 children to adulthood despite the horrific mortality rates of her era. She navigated complex political situations with intelligence and dignity. She spent 13 years as heir to a throne she never reached, waiting with patience that must have been agonizing. And then she died in a rainstorm, 8 weeks too soon, having survived 83 years of European history, only to fall just short of her destiny. It's impossible not to wonder what would have happened if Sophia had lived just 2 more months. Would she have been a good queen? Would she have managed the transition to English culture successfully? Or would her German origins and advanced age have proven insurmountable obstacles? We know she was intelligent, diplomatic, and experienced in court politics. We know she spoke English fluently, having learned it as a child. We know she had studied English history and politics carefully during her 13 years as heir. These qualities suggest she might have been an effective queen, despite her age. On the other hand, she would have been 83 years old at her accession, by far the oldest person ever to become a British monarch. She might have reigned for only months or a few years before dying and passing the crown to George Louis anyway. Her reign would have been a brief transition, rather than a transformative period, but the symbolism would have been powerful. Queen Sophia would have been a woman who gained the throne through her own merit, her intelligence, her learning, her Protestant faith, rather than through marriage. She would have been a queen regnant, not a queen consort. And she would have been the first British monarch in decades who was genuinely interested in intellectual and cultural matters, potentially ushering in a new age of royal patronage for learning. Instead, history gave us King George I, a capable but uninspiring ruler who never loved England and never captured the English people's affection. The Hanoverian succession, which might have begun with an elderly but brilliant philosopher queen, instead began with a middle-aged German elector who spoke no English and preferred hunting to reading. But perhaps that's fitting somehow. Sophia's entire life had been characterized by near misses and might-have-beens. She almost married a future King of England, Charles Stuart, but rejected him. She almost died in childbirth, but survived. Her father almost regained his kingdom, but died in exile. She almost became Queen of Great Britain, but died in a rainstorm. Her story reminds us that history is full of contingencies, of small moments that tip the balance between one outcome and another. A rainstorm on a June evening, a decision to walk in the gardens, a heart that had beaten faithfully for 83 years finally failing. These tiny details determined that Sophia would be remembered as the princess who almost became queen, rather than as Queen Sophia of Great Britain. Yet in another sense, Sophia won. Her son became king, as did her grandson and her great-grandson, and all her descendants down to the present day. The Protestant succession that she embodied was secured. The act of settlement that named her heir remains the law of the land. Every British monarch for more than 3 centuries has been required to be her Protestant descendant. In the Bergarten section of the Herrenhausen Gardens, there is a mausoleum where Sophia rests alongside her husband, Ernest Augustus, and her son, King George I. The building is neoclassical in style, peaceful and dignified. A 300-year-old avenue of linden trees leads to the mausoleum, and the walk is contemplative, beautiful, and quiet. Sophia died where she lived, in the gardens she created, pursuing beauty until her last breath. The rainstorm that killed her also watered the flowers she had planted, the trees she had cultivated, the lawns she had designed. It was, perhaps, a fitting end for a woman who had said, "The garden is my life." And now, dear listener, as you drift towards sleep, I'll let Sophia's story accompany you into dreams. Think of the exiled princess learning 7 languages, the young woman scarred by smallpox but not broken by it, the duchess raising 7 children through dangerous times, the intellectual conversing as an equal with one of history's greatest philosophers, the patron creating gardens that bloom 3 centuries later, the heir waiting 13 years with patience that seems almost superhuman, the elderly woman running through rain toward shelter she would never reach. Think of how close she came. 8 weeks, just 8 weeks, and how that tiny gap between life and throne has defined her place in history. Think of how much she accomplished despite that gap, how her influence shaped centuries, even though she never wore a crown. Sleep now, and dream of Baroque gardens in eternal bloom, amber philosophical discussions that continue even after death, of dynasties founded and legacies that endure, of an elderly woman running through summer rain, of history turning on moments as small as a heartbeat. Good night, dear sleeper. May you rest as peacefully as Sophia rests in her gardens, where the fountains still flow, where the trees still stand, where her memory still lives in every path and parterre. Sweet dreams.